Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait 1 or 2 more minutes before we get started, but we just wanted to make you aware that there are some issues with the landline dial-in or even the mobile dial-in to this program. So if possible, if you're having audio issues or if you're not connected through your computer or directly through the mobile device app, please click on the Join Webinar from your email confirmation on your mobile phone. Download the app as directed, and the webinar will launch automatically and once the app is downloaded and open. So if the webinar does not launch though, click Join Webinar again for your email confirmation, but just be aware folks have reported some difficulties using the telephone numbers to dial into this webinar. If you are unable to actually get to the app to be able to listen to the audio portion, note that this presentation, along with a transcript and a recording, will be available on the Broadband USA website under Events and Past Events on or before June 16th. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for Broadband USA's webinar. My name is Susanna Spellman with Ntia's Broadband USA program. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to Ntia's Broadband USA website. Today's webinar focuses on Ntia's Broadband Infrastructure Program and is the second of a 4-part series. Before we begin, I would like to review the logistics for today's webinar. First, we will open up the webinar for questions after the completion of the presentations. As you hear from each presenter, please use the question box on the right-hand side of the screen to submit your questions or comments. Second, the presentation along with the transcript and audio recording of today's session will be available on the Broadband USA website within 7 days of this webinar under the Events Past Events tab. Finally, please visit our Broadband USA website for more information about our technical assistance programs, including useful guides, products, publications, and other tools that can assist you with planning, funding, and implementing your broadband project. We provide updated information regularly, including a monthly newsletter and other broadband news. Our presenters today are Doug Kinkoff, the Associate Administrator of the Office of Telecommunications and Information Applications, and Jennifer Duane, Director for Grants of the Office of Telecommunications and Information Applications. Now we will turn to our first speaker, Doug Kinkoff. Doug, as I mentioned earlier, is the Associate Administrator of the Office of Telecommunications and Information Applications. Doug joined the Department of Commerce in 2010 and has served in a number of roles working on issues including spectrum management, broadband, and public safety communications. While serving as the head of the Office of Telecommunications and Information Applications, Doug created the agency's Broadband USA program, which works to promote broadband deployment and adoption across communities nationwide. He also oversaw a $4 billion grant program that funded the deployment of broadband infrastructure, public computing centers, sustainable adoption of broadband services, and statewide broadband planning. Before joining the Department of Commerce, Doug held multiple executive roles in the communications industry, as well as in the public and private sectors as a telecommunication policy expert. He served as the Vice President of Operations at SoundPath Conferencing, where he was responsible for all sales, marketing, and customer service operations. His private sector experience also includes serving in senior regulatory and policy roles at EXO Communications, NextLink, and LCI. Doug earned his MA in administration from Central Michigan University and his BS in telecommunications management from Ohio University. Our second speaker is Jennifer Duane. Jennifer is a senior broadband specialist from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration's Broadband USA program, where she manages the office's grant programs and facilitates interagency coordination to support efforts to streamline the federal permitting processes. Jennifer joined NTIA in 2009 to develop policy for the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, otherwise known as VTOP. She then served 2 years as a senior attorney advisor and the Office of Chief Counsel for NTIA, providing legal advice to NTIA offices on a variety of telecommunications, information technology, and commercial data privacy matters. From 2012 to 2017, she served as the Senior Advisor to the Assistant Secretary on matters related to broadband and public safety. Before joining NTIA, Jennifer served as a state regulatory attorney and then as a Director of Federal Regulatory Affairs for Sprint Corporation. She earned an undergraduate degree in economics from the Pennsylvania State University and a Juris Doctorate degree from George Washington University Law School. Please welcome Doug, and he'll open up the remarks.
Thank you, Susanna. On behalf of NTIA, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on our Notice of Funding opportunity for our Broadband Infrastructure Program. I would also like to mention that last Thursday, NTIA published its Notice of Funding opportunity for its Tribal Broadband Grant Program, and we will have more on that program later today. I think this quote's important. The Vice President's quote underscores the fundamental nature that broadband plays in American society today. It's critical to ensure that all Americans, that's 100% of Americans, have access to fast, affordable broadband to allow them to educate their families, have access to remote health care and employment opportunities. These next two slides have maps that I believe highlight two distinct broadband problems that America is facing: infrastructure and digital inclusion. This map, the red areas reflect the areas of the country where broadband service is unavailable at the basic FCC benchmark speed of 25.3. This map highlights households in counties that lack a computer, smartphone, or tablet. The dark brown areas are counties where 30% or more of households do not have a computer, smartphone, or tablet in their home. The broadband divide in this country is significant, and it's one that the administration is now addressing. Next, we're going to dive into the details of the Broadband Infrastructure Grant Program, which is a competitive grant program that opened its application window on May 19th and will award up to $285 million to covered partnerships. Now, I would like to thank you again for joining us today, and I look forward to your questions at the end of the program. Now, let me turn it over to Jennifer Duane, NTIA's Director of Grants. Jennifer?
Well, thanks, Doug. We at NTIA are really excited to be able to announce the opening of the Broadband Infrastructure Program. Now, this program is for $288 million. The eligible applicants are covered partnerships, and those are a state or one or more political subdivisions of a state, and working in collaboration with a fixed broadband service provider. They are deploying covered broadband projects, and these are defined in the Act as a competitively and technologically neutral project for the deployment of fixed broadband service that provides qualifying broadband service in an eligible service area. NTIA announced the opening of the program on May 19th, and we will be accepting applications through August 17th, 2021. I want to highlight a couple of key definitions under the program. First is the definition of qualifying broadband service. That means a download speed of not less than 25 megabits per second and an upload speed of not less than 3 megabits per second with a latency sufficient to support real-time interactive applications. Now, we added a little bit of more context in the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, with regard to the speed. That is the ability to deliver 25.3 simultaneously to every household in the eligible service area. And that's consistent with how USDA Reconnect program, for example, describes the speed threshold for their grant programs. The latency, we added a bit more context as defined as 95% or more of all peak period measurements of network round trip latency, that is between the customer premises and the closest internet core peering interconnection point, are at or below 100 milliseconds. And this is consistent with the FCC's definition of latency that they use in their universal service support programs. So we wanted to be consistent with our federal agency partners in how we define these terms, or this term. The other key definition I want to talk about is the definition of unserved. Now, this means the household lacking access to qualifying broadband service, and no broadband service provider has been selected to receive or is otherwise receiving federal or state funding subject to enforceable build-out commitments to deploy qualifying broadband service in the specific area where the household is located. And eligible service area has been defined in the Act to mean a census block in which broadband service is not available at one or more households or businesses in the census block. And NTIA will be looking at leveraging the FCC's Form 477 data and our National Broadband Availability Map, NBAM. And the FCC Form 77 data is a data layer in that map. And we will be looking at those tools to determine if the area that an applicant submits for funding meets the definition of eligible service area. So under this program, to be eligible for a grant, the covered partnership must submit an application. And we'll be looking at the following elements. We'll be looking at a description of the covered partnership. So we'll want to know whether it's a state or one or more political subdivisions of a state and the fixed broadband service provider. We want to know what the covered broadband project will be, what speeds will be offered, the cost of the project, the proposed service area that the project is proposing to deploy broadband infrastructure in. And then we'll want to know about any other federal and state support that the broadband service provider that is part of the covered partnership might be receiving under another federal or state support program for broadband investments. Now, under the statute, the covered partnership may only submit one application for this grant program. For purposes of we're looking at the state or the political subdivision of the state as the lead applicant, and that would be the entity that would determine whether the covered partnership can submit that application. So the covered partnership may include one or more provider of fixed broadband services in its application. And a fixed broadband service provider may participate in more than one covered partnership, but the state or governmental entity can only submit one application as part of the covered partnership. The Act defines several funding priorities in decreasing order of importance. So the first priority is for projects designed to provide broadband service to the greatest number of households in an eligible service area. Now we'll be interpreting this priority as the providing broadband service to the greatest number of unserved households in the eligible service area. The second priority is focused on providing broadband service in an eligible service area that is outside of a county, city, town, or urbanized area that's contiguous or adjacent to a city or town with more than 50,000 inhabitants. So essentially, we'll be prioritizing broadband service in more rural areas. We'll also be looking at projects that are the most cost-effective, prioritizing projects that are the most rural. And then finally, the fourth criteria is looking at projects designed to provide broadband service with a download speed of at least 100 megabits per second and an upload speed of at least 20 megabits per second. So the Act has given us a very aggressive timeline for deploying broadband infrastructure under this program. It requires that the covered partnership must expend the grant funds within 1 year of their receipt of the grant funds. Now, we know that the projects under this program will be for broadband construction, and that there may be some projects that are capable of deploying broadband within 1 year, but for the most part, applicants will require more than 1 year to complete their broadband construction projects. And in that case, the Act provides that the Assistant Secretary may grant extensions of the award period. So to qualify for the extension, the covered partnership just must certify that it has a plan for use of the funds, the construction project is underway, or extenuating circumstances require an extension to ensure project completion. So we are allowing applicants to submit that request for extension with their application because we realize that most projects will need more than 1 year to complete. So we're giving applicants the option to just go ahead and submit their extension request along with their application. And the petition for extension should cover the elements that I just noted about the factors that the Assistant Secretary will be looking at in terms of whether to grant the extension. So under this program, we have $288 million available in grant funds. We expect to make awards ranging from $5 million to $30 million. Applicants may submit project proposals that are outside of the amounts, but we'll want to see an explanation, a reasonable explanation for why the project cost exceeds these funding ranges. Now, the Act does not require a matching funds, so that is not a statutory requirement as it often is in grant programs, but we will be offering a preference for applicants that do propose to provide a cost share amount to fund a portion of the eligible cost of the project, and looking at least a project that provides a 10% cost match. So to fund, to submit an application under this program, an applicant will need a few things. They'll need a DUNS number, the Dun and Bradstreet number. They'll need to be registered with SAM, the System for Award Management, and they'll need to have a grants.gov account. We'll be using grants.gov for the submission of applications under this program. And the NOFO really goes into detail on all three of these items: how to request a DUNS number, how to register for SAM and to keep that registration active, and how to register for grants.gov account. So I would direct you to look at the NOFO for those description of those requirements and what is needed to fulfill these three elements to apply for a grant under this program. So the NOFO outlines in Section D the application package for the Broadband Infrastructure Program. We'll be using the standard F424 family of forms, the application for federal assistance, the budget for construction programs in the 424C. There's a couple of other assurances and certifications regarding lobbying activities that will be required to submit with applications. The project narrative is a Word document where, and this is where the applicant really describes the project, the covered partnership, what they're proposing to deploy and where, the proposed service area, how they're meeting the funding priorities of the Act. So this is where the applicant really should devote most of its time in terms of preparing an application, so they can look at the funding priorities that we'll be focused on and really explain to us how their applications are satisfying the priorities of the program, and looking at identifying exactly what they're doing, measurable milestones, performance outcomes. So this is really the meat of the application that NTIA will be looking at. We'll be also focused on the budget and looking at what costs are proposed for funding under this grant program, and how those costs are aligning against cost objectives that you will see in those standard forms. And then if the applicant is proposing to recover indirect costs, we'll want to see the indirect cost rate agreement. And this is all described in detail in the NOFO. We're also asking for letters of commitment from each of the covered members of the covered partnership to indicate their commitment to complete the project, looking at maps of the eligible service area and financial pro forma documents and network design documents. And those items are all covered in detail in the NOFO as to exactly what we're looking for. So as I mentioned at the beginning, since we opened the program on May 19th, we have a 90-day statutory deadline for when applications must be received. So our deadline under this program is August 17th, 2021. And since it's a statutory definition, we cannot grant any extensions of that timeline. And like applicants, NTIA also has a statutory deadline to complete its review and selection of successful applicants to either complete its review and approve or deny the applications and determine what awards it will make. Our deadline is November 15th, 2021, where we need to make some internal decisions on the applications that we've received under this program. So I want to touch on a couple of the eligible uses for the program. Grant funds may only be expended on allowable costs, and those are outlined in the Uniform Administrative Requirements and the cross principles. The Act also identifies several eligible uses of the grant funds. And since this is a broadband construction grant program, we are, of course, allowing the cost of construction, the improvement or acquisition of facilities and equipment required to provide qualifying broadband service. And this could include infrastructure for backhaul, middle and last mile networks. We're allowing the cost of long-term leases, the cost to engineer the network for permitting, work that's related to environmental and historical cultural reviews, personnel costs, salaries, fringe benefits. And then the Act also allows for reasonable pre-application expenses or grant preparation costs to be recovered, but that amount may not exceed $50,000. The Act also identifies a couple of ineligible costs, and these are costs where grant funds may not be expended on them. So just to touch on a couple of items here, they're described in detail within the NOFO, but so a covered partnership may not use grant funds to purchase or support any communications equipment or service as defined in Section 9 of the Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act of 2019. And this is designed to prohibit the purchase of equipment that may pose a national security risk. So we'll be looking to make sure that grant funds are not used for these purchases. And this applies to both members of the covered partnership, so both the state or political subdivision and the fixed broadband service provider. There are a couple of items that are specific to the provider of broadband service that is part of the covered partnership. And that is that grant funds may not use to repay or a loan by a public or private lender, and may not be used for collateral for a loan. Same thing with the grant amount. Preparation costs are allowable, but they may not exceed $50,000. And we also are going to be looking at to not duplicate funding for any funds that have been used to fund service to a location that the FCC Universal Service Program is also funding. So since these are broadband infrastructure projects, there will be environmental and historic preservation requirements that applicants must adhere to. So when you submit your application, we'll be asking for environmental documentation to be submitted. It's not required that you have all of this in place when you submit their application, but we need to understand what what construction and ground disturbing activities that the project will undertake and how the environmental and historic preservation requirements will be met. So when we want to see what your plan is for obtaining any of the required federal, tribal, state, local government permits and approvals. So we need sufficient information within the application in order to undertake the analysis that is required by the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. And once we make an award, we may withhold some of the funds under a specific award condition until these environmental and historic preservation requirements are satisfied. So this slide lists the evaluation criteria that NTIA will be looking at when we receive an application for a grant under this program. So the first criteria is we'll be looking at the project purpose and benefits, and that's worth 30 points. So we're going to be looking at the level of impact in the proposed service area. We'll be looking at the number of unserved households that the project is proposing to serve, at what speeds that the service may be offered. We'll be looking at the affordability of the services that will be offered. The second category is project viability, and that's 40 points. We'll be looking at the technical approach and the related network capacity and performance. And that basically means we're going to be looking at the type of network and broadband infrastructure the applicant's proposing to deploy, at what speeds, and we'll be also awarding certain points based on the level of on the network capacity requirements that the applicant will propose. We'll be looking at the applicant's organizational capability as well, looking at the ability, the experience of the applicant, which basically includes the members of the covered partnership, to carry out the project and complete the activities that it proposes to deploy under this grant program. And then finally, we'll be looking at the project budget and sustainability, looking at the reasonableness of the budget and the costs associated with that budget, and to make sure that costs are properly allocated to perform the tasks that are needed to complete the project. We'll be looking at sustainability of the project, whether there's a plan that the project will be sustainable beyond the award period, and looking at whether it's designed to support evolving and advanced communication capabilities such as 5G or fiber. And then finally, we'll be looking at whether the applicant is proposing a non-cost share, and so a non-federal cost share of up to 10%, and the applicant may receive some additional points in consideration if they provide a non-federal cost share that of at least 10% of the total eligible project costs. So this outlines the review process that NTIA will use for this broadband infrastructure program. When we receive applications, the first thing we'll do is conduct an administrative and eligibility review of complete application package, and that's to make sure that the application is complete, that the covered partnership has the entities that are needed to make it eligible to submit an application under this program. And then we'll be looking at what it's proposing to do, because we're going to be doing a priority sequencing. When I discussed the priorities a couple of slides ago, we're going to be the number one priority under the Act is to deliver qualifying broadband service to the greatest number of households in a proposed service area. So we're going to be looking at and focusing initially on applicants that come in with that type of proposal to deliver broadband service to unserved households. And we'll continue that priority sequencing through the remaining priorities to the extent that funding remains available under the program. And the second stage is merit review, and that's where the applicants are evaluated by at least 2 objective reviewers who have demonstrated expertise in the programmatic elements of the grant program. Now we're using a scoring scale of 0 to 100, and applications that score on our threshold between at least 70, that receive at least 70 points and up to 100 points through merit review will advance to our programmatic review. And this is where NTIA will focus on its review of the applications, looking at how the priorities, how the application project advances the funding priorities outlined in the NOFO. And to do this, for instance, in verifying the eligible service area, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be using data from the FCC Form 477 for validation of proposed service areas as eligible. We'll be looking at leveraging other data sets that are available in the NBAM to target funding to unserved areas. And we'll also have a process for existing broadband service providers to let us know if any proposed service area that has been proposed for funding, whether they currently provide qualifying broadband service to that area. So there's a process outlined in the NOFO where we will announce those proposed service areas and allow existing broadband service providers to provide us with information that essentially may challenge the proposed service areas that an applicant has submitted for funding under this grant program. So this outlines the selection factors and the selection process that NTIA will use when in determining what applications to award grant funding. So we'll be looking at the scores and the technical comments from the objective expert reviewers during merit review. We'll be looking at the analysis of NTIA staff during the programmatic review. We'll be looking how the application satisfies the Broadband Infrastructure Program priorities that I described in the earlier slides, those 4 funding priorities, and then the extent to which the applicant proposes to contribute a non-federal cost share. And then we'll also be looking at an equitable geographic distribution of the proposed grant award. So we're not going to fund projects in only one state. We want to try to make sure that there is a equitable geographic distribution across the country. It doesn't necessarily mean that every state will get an award, but we do want to make sure that we're distributing the awards in an equitable manner geographically. And then we'll be looking at the extent to which this investment would not have been made in the proposed service area without the government investment. So, or that is unlikely to be made using private sources of funds and needs the government investment in order to be funded. And then we'll be looking at whether the applicant proposes some strong labor protections, including paying prevailing wages. And then finally, we'll be looking to avoid duplicating the funding of other federal agencies, including the Department of Agriculture loan and grant programs and the applicable universal service programs that the FCC manages. And then finally, the availability of funds will be determining how many awards we are able to make for this program. With $288 million, it's not a lot to fund broadband infrastructure deployment, so that will be a key determinant of the amount and the number of awards that we're able to award here. And this just highlights a couple of just award administration information that will be applicable to awardees. So applicants that we do fund under this program will receive a federal award notice. It'll be from our the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, which is our grants office under this program. We will, of course, notify applicants that are not successful in receiving an award. But if you do receive an award, there will be certain administrative and national policy requirements that you have to adhere to. The uniform administrative requirements and cost principles. The Department of Commerce has some standard financial assistance terms and conditions that will apply. Of course, the environmental, national historical preservation requirements I touched on earlier will come into play here. Looking at, there will be some requirements that any grant funded assets under this program that will have a federal interest in, and will have a property trust relationship with any assets that are funded under this program. There'll be a requirement for open network requirements to keep the network our infrastructure that's funded under this program to be open for interconnection by other broadband service providers. And looking at domestic preference for procurements or Buy American, and then looking at contracting with small minority business, women's business enterprises, and labor surplus areas firms, looking for preferences and contracting with those entities. And then finally, reporting. There'll be reporting requirements that are outlined in the NOFO, both financial reporting and performance reporting on a semi-annual basis. And then there will also be an annual reporting requirement where we'll be looking at awardees to tell us what they expended their grant funds on, what outcomes and services they delivered as a result of using grant funds under this program. So as I described on a couple of slides, we do have a merit review process where we are using objective reviewers to look at the applications that were received. So we are actively looking for merit reviewers to volunteer to serve as a reviewer for this program. So we'll start merit reviews in August and into October, and we really just want to make this an announcement and ask for your help to volunteer to serve as a reviewer for this program, you can submit a resume at the information at the email noted here, grantreviewer@ntia.gov, and provide the information that's indicated in the bullet points on this slide: your name, residence, email, employer, position, years of experience, and in fields related to broadband activities. So I hope you'll consider volunteering for this, to serve as a merit reviewer for this program. We would definitely welcome your help. So now I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Susanna Spellman, and we will now entertain questions on the Broadband Infrastructure Program. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer and Doug. We have been collecting all of the questions that you have been typing into the chat box. Thank you so much. They are great questions. I also wanted to make sure you all are aware of that last week we did post some frequently asked questions for the Broadband Infrastructure Program, and we are also going to be publishing an additional round with new questions in the next week or so. We will also take these questions. If we don't get to your direct question, we will take these questions and incorporate them into subsequent rounds of FAQs as well, if they aren't already addressed in new rounds of FAQs that we're in the process of reviewing, approving, writing, etc. So with that being said, I think we've got everybody here. I also want to introduce a special guest, Dean Iwasaki. He is from the NIST Grants Office. So if there are any grant office specific questions, he is there to assist. So, all right, let's get the questions. Here we go. I think this is a good one for Jennifer. Does the covered partnership have to be a formal legal entity where both entities have an equity stake in the business?
No, it doesn't. I mean, what the Act requires, defines a covered partnership as a state or one or more political subdivisions of a state and the fixed broadband service provider. We recognize that covered partnerships is not a common, understanding within grants, and we were trying to make developing these partnerships as as less prescriptive as possible. So there's no need for a formal legal arrangement before that, before you submit an application. We just need to understand who are, the identities of the covered partnership, what state, what political subdivisions are going to be involved, what fixed broadband service providers need to be involved. So that's the extent of the formal arrangement that we're requiring. We do ask for letters of commitment from the members of the covered partnership, so we understand that they'll are committed to participating in the project and making sure that it's complete and adhering to our requirements.
So a follow-up question to that is, what entities actually qualify as a political subdivision of a state?
So the Act didn't define political subdivision, and the NOFO didn't either. We were, trying not to be too prescriptive in that sense, but, we understand that political subdivisions are created by the state to fulfill governmental functions and are expressly defined in state statutes. When we think of political subdivisions, we usually think of cities, towns, municipalities, and so those are the entities that we typically consider to be political subdivisions, but each state should have a definition of what constitutes a political subdivision. And so if there's any question that whether you're an entity that's not a political subdivision, then we'll ask that when you submit your application that you identify the statutory provision within your state that indicates that you qualify as a political subdivision, and that would go into the project narrative where you would describe what the entity is and how it qualifies under the state as a political subdivision. And the other piece, NTI, there's no question that a state is a political subdivision. So one of the things that we have done in the NOFO is to encourage political subdivisions to work with their state broadband office and on project proposals. And there's even, if they wanted to submit, like almost bundle some of their political subdivision project proposals, and the state submits the application, and that's perfectly acceptable under the NOFO. And you know, so if there's any doubt in an entity's mind whether they qualify as a political subdivision, you know, let us know. We encourage you to consult your state statute to make that determination, and also work with your state to, you know, work on the proposal and submit that under this program.
Thank you. So Doug, here's a good question. If a municipally owned network by themselves, are they considered a covered partnership since the municipality actually owns the service provider?
No, we interpret the statute envisions two parties, either a state or political subdivision and a provider of fixed broadband. So they could be one or the other, but they can't serve both roles.
Okay, so that would be the same for a municipal cooperative provider, et cetera. They would have to establish a relationship with a political subdivision.
Correct.
Okay. Jennifer, will projects that are currently underway in which funds have already been expended be eligible for retroactive funding if part of a larger project?
No, grant funds may not be applied to retroactive project costs. So, you know, any federal and non-federal funds that are committed to an award may only be used to recover allowable and costs incurred during the period of performance. So, and then, you know, if applicants are, they are allowed to recover up to $50,000 to use grant funding if they're awarded to recover the cost of their grant preparation costs. But, you know, in general, federal, you know, you must incur the cost during the award period of performance.
Doug, can multiple neighboring municipalities submit a joint application with one broadband service provider?
Yes, a service provider can serve more than one area, and we do support consortiums. So multiple political subdivisions can come together with a state, and that provider can serve more than one area of that state. You can also have more than one fixed provider being part of the consortium.
So a private company could be a partner in multiple applications?
Yes.
Okay. Can a project include non-contiguous census blocks or submit multiple locations in a single application? I think you sort of answered this, but the non-contiguous census blocks, I think, is a good designation to understand.
Yeah, they don't need to be contiguous. We're looking at, I mean, basically the way the Act defines unserved, it's a census block where, you know, one or more households lacks access to qualifying broadband service. So, you know, we're looking at proposals that may want to, you know, take different census blocks that you know, meet that definition and submit them as part of the eligible service area that the project proposes to cover. So there's no requirement that it be contiguous census blocks. We're really trying to hone in on the areas where there's, you know, a need for the broadband service and a lack of access to qualifying broadband service.
So that, I guess, falls into where, given the scoring priority and criteria, is Ntia prioritizing large-scale projects that propose to serve the largest number of unserved locations? Is that going to be prioritized over a smaller project serving a single political subdivision with a service provider or a smaller location?
I mean, not necessarily. We're going to be looking at, you know, projects where, you know, that are focused or that are targeting on the greatest number of households, of serving unserved households in the proposed service area. But the Act does identify some other funding priorities that we'll also be looking at, and that I mentioned during the presentation. And, you know, the funding areas outside of urban areas are focusing on rural areas, looking at broadband speeds, deploying in excess of 100 megabits per second or 20 upload and 20 megabits per second download. So we'll also be looking at projects that also have those you know, priorities as also looking at them for funding.
Doug, we've gotten a lot of questions about the FCC National Broadband Map, the Form 477 data, as being one of the inputs for determining eligibility. So our question is to what extent will NTIA use the National Broadband Map and the FCC data to determine if a census block is eligible for funding under the program?
We'll use the FCC 477 data, but it's incorporated into our National Broadband Availability Map, and we'll use that to help assess the proposed service areas. We also, in the National Broadband Availability Map, have data from various federal agencies, speed test data from Ookla measurement labs, et cetera. We also have specific state data that is loaded into that map, and all of that will be used to help us identify and assess the availability at 25.3 or below in those various service areas.
So to follow on with that, if according to the FCC's National Broadband Map, a census block has fixed broadband service, but that service for that census block or part of that block is less than 25 megabits down and 25 down, 3 up. Is that service eligible for funding under this program?
It is. The statute and the NOFA make areas available if there's one household or business in the census block that do not have access to 25.3 service. So those areas within the tract or the block that are not served at 25.3 are eligible for award under this program.
Could you share with the folks, where there's kind of map-based data on broadband service coverage to help applicants actually determine the eligibility of a proposed service area?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things. One, I think a couple good sites are our February 21st webinar, and these are out on the Broadband USA website. There's a couple of links to the February 21st webinar and PowerPoint on data as the foundation of broadband planning. And there's also the April 21st webinar PowerPoint, which provides an overview of data sets, et cetera. Those are two good sources. Also, given that this is states and political subdivisions, we have 36 states now that have access to the NBAM through a joint program agreement. They can provide access to their data and what's there to the political subdivisions if they wish. So I would recommend that the political subdivisions that are part of the program work with their state broadband offices to get some of that access to some of the NBAM data.
So that just follows. So how do applicants actually get access to the NBAM data? What if their state isn't participating in the NBAM partnership?
Then they would not have access to the National Broadband Availability Map or the NBAM. Right now we have 36. If they, in order to have access, because there is some, what I'll say, commercial data sets that we cannot disclose publicly, they have to have a signed agreement with us, which we call a JPA. And we are working with more than the 36 to get additional contracts, but right now we have 36 signed agreements. So they would have to find other sources such as the FCC data and or some of those sites that I presented a minute ago out on Broadband USA.
To what extent will NTIA be examining any state-based data or state-based studies or even county or political subdivision broadband collection data efforts that they have done as a part of determining the eligibility of the service area and level of need?
I'm sorry, just the system. I missed the first part of that.
So will NTIA accept from applicants data that they have developed either through relationships with the state, with other political subdivisions, et cetera, that have done maybe more granular broadband data collection and mapping efforts?
Absolutely. We will accept all of that type of data in the application. We want to make the most accurate decision as possible. So yes, we would be open to accepting that data.
Right. All right, Jenna.
If I could just add to that, we're also open to any other states that want to sign a JPA to get access to the map to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to get that taken care of.
So we've also gotten a lot of questions about federal funding and helping to maximize federal investments into broadband. So just generically, if any portion of the proposed service area has already received federal funding for broadband service, is the whole project ineligible for the award?
No, I mean, I don't think we can say that up front. I mean, basically, our intention is to fund eligible areas for which there are no other federal funds awarded and or leveraged to provide qualifying broadband service. But we'll need to see what proposed service area an applicant comes in with, and if there's a portion that might be ineligible, we have the ability to just scope the area to make sure that the area that we really focus on is truly unserved, because there's not a lot of funding available. We want to make sure it's targeted to the areas most in need of funding. So we can't say outright that it wouldn't be. We need to make sure that make sure that if there is federal funding, that it's a qualifying broadband service, and if there is any portion that's not being targeted with that funding, that would be an eligible area for funding under this program.
So that follows with, how is NTIA, the FCC, and then USDA coordinating, giving all the prior, current, and ongoing federal funding investments in broadband deployment? Doug smiles big with that question.
There is a lot of funding going on, and we have and are engaging with each other on a regular basis, regular meeting cadence. So we are working diligently with the FCC, USDA, starting to bring Treasury into that, on how we share data to ensure that all of our programs, not just our program, right? It's our data to them, it's their data to us, of how do we ensure that we are not ending up with a duplication of funding to an area.
And we also have a few questions about the FCC RDOF program, specifically because the FCC has only preliminarily awarded funding for the different applicants there. Are they going to be, those service areas that the RDOF provisionally awarded applicants are planning to serve, are they eligible under this program, even if the final awards are not yet decided?
So I think, the definition of unserved in the NOFO indicates that, that there has to be federal, like an entity has to have been selected to receive or is otherwise receiving the federal or state funding, and that's subject to enforceable build-out commitments to deploy qualifying broadband service in the specific area where the household is located by date certain. So at this point, if there hasn't been an award yet to a specific area, if it's only preliminarily awarded, but it's going through the long form process and hasn't yet been selected, then yes, that area could be considered for funding under this program. As Doug mentioned, we are coordinating with USDA and with FCC and RUS to make sure that all of the funding is out there, is properly targeted to unserved areas. So that would be something we would need to coordinate with the FCC on the timing of their RDOF awards to make sure that we're not duplicating funding. But we couldn't say outright that they wouldn't be eligible at this point, because it's not yet determined whether that area would get funding under RDOF.
So I think we sort of answered this, but I think it's probably important to make this designation say this kind of straight and clear. Are areas that have already received federal funding for broadband infrastructure projects providing service less than 25.3 eligible for funding under this program?
Yes, I mean, the threshold under this program is qualifying broadband service, which is 25.3 latency, sufficient latency. So to the extent that there's federal funding to an area that has received funding for less than that, then they would be eligible to apply for funding under this program.
So to follow with that, would a project that's proposing 100 megs down and 20 megs up or greater be approved in areas that already have 25 megs, 25 down, 3 up?
No, it would not be a qualifying area under the statute or the notice of funding, because it meets the standard of qualified service.
Right. Okay. Hold on, I'm getting through. More questions are coming in, so I'm logging them as we go. So bear with me for a second. How about this? We've gotten a lot of questions about the environmental and historic preservation requirements. Will the applicants need to have the environmental review completed prior to submitting the application, or is it okay if it's just initiated?
Yes, that we understand that some of these proposals are just coming, developing, and there's not sufficient time yet to conduct the full environmental review process. So in the project narrative, it indicates that applicants should just provide us with information about whether their project will involve ground disturbing activities or other broadband construction that will require environmental and historical preservation compliance. And we'll be evaluating to make sure that those projects do comply with the NEPA, but it doesn't have to be completed when they submit their applications.
Okay. Another question that folks have been asking is which member of the covered partnership, the political subdivision or the service provider, would retain ownership of the infrastructure or associated assets funded by the grant program. Could the members of the covered partnership decide which entity would fund or operate the infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, so as I mentioned, covered partnership is not a traditional grant term. So when we, but this is what we were required by statute to designate as our eligible applicants under this program. But under, when we make an award, the entity will become a recipient. And since we've designated the state or the political subdivision to be the lead applicant, they will become the recipient of the award. The fixed broadband service provider piece of the partnership can be a subrecipient, or they can be a contractor helping the political subdivision or state deploy the project. But under our Department of Commerce grant rules and the uniform administrative requirements, a owner of grant funded property must be either the recipient or a subrecipient. So the members of the covered partnership can decide where they want to fall under, like in terms of where they how they want to participate as a recipient or subrecipient. But the entity that holds title or owns the grant funded property needs to be either the recipient or a subrecipient.
Okay. So we have a couple grants questions that have come in. Specifically regarding what form of documentation needs to be provided to show that the applicant has a valid SAM registration. Will a screenshot of the entity registration from SAM website be sufficient? Dean, this is definitely up your alley.
Okay, so no documentation needs to be provided for that verification. Your grants.gov profile is linked to sam.gov, so the Prime, there's an automatic connection there. And then later on, if selected as a grantee, the grants office will do all of the validation. So there would be nothing to submit.
All right, and here's another follow-up question. Specifically on Form 424C, the budget info form, line 17. One of the participants wants to understand what is federal percentage share?
So the federal percentage share is how much of the project, the total award amount, that is federal dollars. So if you're not including any kind of cost share, then it would be 100%. If you're doing that 10% that was referenced, then it would be 90% federal share, 10% non-federal share. So the percentage is dependent on your own budget.
This is a question, I think, for Jennifer. Can ARPA funds, for example, the recent Treasury program funds, be used to provide the suggested 10% match?
That's a good question, because typically, a cost match cannot be made from federal sources. So unless it's explicitly allowed within that federal funding program. So for instance, like the community development block grants specifically allow them to be used as a cost share for another federal program. So I think we'd have to figure out or take a look at what Treasury, what their guidelines are with respect to using their funds to provide a cost share match under this program.
Here's another question about eligible areas. If only one household or business has the qualifying broadband service of 25.3 within a single census block, is the entire census block ineligible, or can the applicant serve the other households or businesses that don't have that service?
They can serve the other, right? The standard or the threshold is if even one household or business does not have 25.3, then you can serve those that don't have it. So in that case, you could serve the other, if there's 100 households, one has 25.3 and the other 99 don't, you could serve those other 99 households. They would be eligible in the project. If I understood your question.
I think so, yeah. I think they just want to know that even if if one census tract or block is deemed, it says they're qualified according to the FCC site, but there are homes or businesses that aren't being served because the FCC definition is just one to be served, to call it being served, that those other areas are eligible. You could build to those other areas. So I think yes.
Correct, you could.
Okay, keep going. Sorry. Sorry. Somebody wants us to go over the population qualifications again. I think it's the under the priority to rural areas, but it's not explicitly rural areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, and that's not, I think we've gotten some questions as whether that, that's areas outside of that are ineligible for the program. And I think that, it's not that they're ineligible for funding, but it's just a prioritization factor that we'll be looking at prioritizing funding to areas that are outside of urban areas. So outside of a county or city or town with more than 50,000 inhabited. So it's not like those areas are, ineligible to apply to the program, but just given the prioritization to focus more on rural areas and the availability of the funding, ultimately they may not be selected, but it's not a gating factor. Like they can submit an application to cover those areas, but just recognize that under the statute and the prioritization factors, the focus really is on rural areas outside of these urban areas.
If an area already has fiber to the home, but for some reason not providing 25.3, is the area still eligible for new construction? Or could the existing provider use grant funds to speed up the existing fiber to the home network? That might be a tough one, I think.
So you're saying that they already have fiber to the home, and
but for some reason it's not providing 25.3, which is surprising.
Yeah,
the threshold, for the qualifying broadband service is 25.3. If an applicant comes in saying there's fiber to the home, but it's not providing that threshold level, then, I guess it's something that we could consider. It wouldn't be ineligible to submit an application, but I think it's something we'd have to take a close look at.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jennifer. I think that if there is fiber to the home, there's going to be some discussions with the carrier, and they would have a challenge process too.
Right.
Because I would struggle to see many fiber to the homes being served below 25.3. It could happen, but I think it would raise questions with the program officer.
Right. Still looking. A lot of these questions I think we've covered, or they're questions that we need to discuss further internally because they're good policy questions that we need to make sure go along with the actual statute and the funding guidelines. When you apply, will it allow us to apply for the planning, design, and construction phases?
Yeah, I mean, that could be part of the proposal. I mean, it's focused on primarily broadband deployment, but we recognize that there are certain preliminary phases that a project may need to go through. We are allowing some engineering design costs to be eligible. So I couldn't say that that's not ineligible, but we are looking at, funding projects that for broadband deployment for construction. But, I couldn't rule out a project that contains all phases of those. But keeping in mind that, there is a limit, in terms of when to expend the funds. Of course, we can give extensions, but, the planning phase, need to factor in how long the planning phase will take versus the construction deployment phase in terms of the overall project period of performance.
Okay. And I think we covered this. But I think it's worth saying because we're still getting a few questions about who has to be the lead applicant. One, there's been a few questions. Does it have to be the state? And I think the answer to that is no, it doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be the state because the statute allows either a state or one or more political subdivisions of a state to apply and be part of the public part of the covered partnership. So it could be one political subdivision combining with a fixed broadband service provider, or several political subdivisions. As I mentioned, we are encouraging applicants to consult with their state broadband office because the state has a lot of insight into where there might be areas of need within the state. So, but they don't necessarily, as long as there's either the state or a political subdivision of a state that is part of the covered partnership that submits the application, then it should be fine, and the state doesn't necessarily have to be part of that.
Okay. Just going through more. Can a state participate in a partnership without being the lead applicant?
Well, it needs to be the governmental entity to be the lead applicant. So the state could be part of a covered partnership that includes one or more of its political subdivisions, and the political subdivision could be the lead applicant, the governmental entity part of the covered partnership. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the state, but it does need to be a governmental entity that is the lead applicant.
Okay. And then we have a question here. If the state or political subdivision is the lead applicant, do they complete the online application process? And that answer is yes, generally, because they're the applicant.
Well, I think, and Dean, this is where you may know, I mean, in terms of how grants.gov operates, I mean, there is like this like a workspace. So I think other groups could be on there working on the application, but the authorized representative, needs to, we need to have an authorized representative from a governmental entity that would take responsibility for the project. But I don't know that they necessarily have to be the one that actually pushes the button in grants.gov and submits the application. And Dean, I don't know whether you have any insight on, because I've never actually been on grants.gov submitting an application, but you may have some more experience there.
Yeah, so that's correct. That the partners could put together the application, but ultimately it's the governmental entity, the authorized rep from that. They would have to click the submit button.
Yeah, but others could be involved in the preparation, of the
Yes.
application because of this workspace format on grants.gov. But ultimately, it's the lead applicant and the governmental entity that needs to kind of hit submit.
Correct.
Keep looking through it. We've had a few questions about the network to be an open network requirement, and that is something, Jennifer, you did mention that is part of the NOFO and a requirement for awardees.
Yeah, it's similar, just to since we're funding these network builds, there is just a requirement to that'll be part of the specific award conditions that the network be open for interconnection. The NOFO describes kind of what the conditions would be, open for interconnection by other providers, reasonable, discriminatory terms and conditions. So that's something that we want to make sure that since we're funding these networks, that they will be open for other providers to access or to interconnect with.
I think this is a good question for Dean. Is the SAM and Dun and Bradstreet code of the ISP required or of the political subdivision when applying?
It's of the prime, so it's the prime's information. So it would be the governmental entity, the applicant.
And then there's a question that I know I can answer very easily. Is the NOFO available to download? Yes, if you Google Broadband USA and NTIA, you'll get to the Broadband USA website, and there is a link for grants, and you will see the different grant programs that we have 2 other grant programs that we're working to administer right now. But you'll see the Broadband Infrastructure Grant Program, you'll see the NOFO, as well as a set of FAQs, and additional FAQs will be posted as they become available, as we kind of go through them. And a lot of these questions will turn into FAQs as well. So one person here is looking at an application with 3 political subdivisions and a provider. Do you need 1 lead applicant, or will all 3 of the political subdivisions need to be up to date with DUNS and SAM?
So I guess it would be one of the political subdivisions would, become the lead applicant, the one of the 3, and make sure that they have all the registration information active in SAM, they're registered with grants.gov and so forth. But we wouldn't, all 3 don't need to be, it would just need to be one of the political subdivisions, and they can decide which one they wanted to take the lead. Dean, do you have any other insights there?
That would be my response.
Okay.
Dean, here's another one. How can we check that our SAM registration is current?
So you should be able to log into sam.gov. It's an annual kind of registration. And so, by logging into sam.gov, you'd be able to see your status. I do know that it takes a while for the, the annual re-registration process to happen. So I would start that sooner rather than later, just because, again, you need that in order to submit your application.
If an ISP partners with the city, can we include rural areas outside of the city limits in our application?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I don't see there'd be an issue. As long as they met the definition of, eligible service area and unserved, that should be fine.
All right, keeping going. This is a good, I mean, there's a lot of questions. As we all know, the statute says we need to build in a year, but there is realities of environmental, historic preservation reviews that can delay things. There's been rumors in the world of delays in being able to procure fiber. So what is the maximum amount of time that an awardee has to complete the broadband network builds?
There was no established time frame. The Assistant Secretary can grant extensions and can do that. There was no restriction on the length of time or granting it for an additional year or 2 years and then granting another one. Given supply chain issues, environmental and not just supply chain and environmental clearance, you might have forest fires, you might have earthquakes, you might have other things that impact build that we've seen through the years. So there is no specific restriction. Jennifer, I don't know if you.
Yeah, so I think what, as I mentioned, that there is that ability for the Assistant Secretary to grant an extension. So there'd be an opportunity for the covered partnership to submit their petition for extension. And within that, you indicate that, some of the if there's you need to go through environmental, and that's going to take at least a year. There's other supply chain issues, and so you would want to document like what are some of the circumstances that you're facing that in which you would need more than 1 year to complete the broadband infrastructure deployment project. So we'd want you to tell us how much time you need, because Doug mentioned that there is no necessarily time limit other than that 1 year time limit. So we need to understand, whether it's another 2 years, another 3 years, 4 years. And we always have the ability to do no cost extensions. So, even maybe on top of that. But the idea would be when you come in to request your extension, explain why you need the extension and how much time you think you'll need to complete the project. And that will determine, in our purposes, how much of an additional award period to provide.
So I'm getting a few more questions that kind of want us to restate, in particular, a little bit about the served, underserved designation if a entire census block or only a portion of a census block is being served. I just wanted to remind everyone, I know we're going through a lot of questions and going through things quickly, but next week we will be posting a transcript as well as the recording and the slides from this presentation, so you can go back and revisit some of those questions if you just need to follow up and re-clarify things.
And Susanna, the FAQs that are going to be
Yes.
up regularly, I think that'll help also.
All right. Can matching funds be in-kind professional services?
Yes, in-kind are allowable costs, and and services, because we're allowing. And when you say professional services, I'm assuming you make consulting services or something of that nature. But there are, and the eligible uses of the funds are salaries and for project managers and other that are involved in deploying the project. So cost matching share would also be, those kind of professional services would also be eligible, and indirect costs are allowable as match. I'm sorry, in-kind. Like in-kind costs are eligible for match.
We're having a couple questions too, specifically around some of the FCC's programs, specifically whether or not ACAM or CAF ICC recipients are eligible or ineligible to apply.
They would be eligible as long as it's not a duplication.
Yeah, I think we can't upfront say that they're ineligible to apply, because we need to understand what service area they're proposing, and we're going to need to coordinate with the FCC to make sure that if the FCC is already paying for deployment costs in that service area, that we don't duplicate that funding. But we can't outright say that they're not eligible, because there may be areas of their territory that are not being funded by an FCC program, and so we just need to understand where those gaps are.
And just so long as they are part of a covered partnership.
Right.
I've got another matching fund question. Who has to pony up the matching funds? The lead applicant or the ISP?
Either one. It's up to the covered partnership parties to determine. And as I mentioned, a match is not required. It's not required by the statute. We're not requiring it, but we are giving a preference to those entities that do come in and provide up to a 10% cost match that are matching the eligible cost of the project. But it's not a requirement, and either party, whether it's the state or political subdivision part of the covered partnership or the fixed broadband service provider, either one or both can provide the matching funds.
A question in the same vein. Can the grant fund construction be undertaken by either the provider partner, the service provider, the municipal entity, or both?
The construction piece?
I think it's all of them.
Yeah, it's all of them. Yeah.
All right. Try to see. So this has been another question. A lot of political subdivision states, cities, et cetera, have their own bidding processes and requirements for procurement. Are those required by the statute or the NOFO?
I mean, they're not, we don't require, as I mentioned, there's no formal legal arrangement or apartment agreement that needs to be entered into between the entities. If the political subdivision does have a requirement to do some kind of procurement to select a, broadband service provider, that's something we'll have to factor in. What we do need to know at the time of application submission, who is the political subdivision part of the covered partnership or the state, and who is going to be the fixed broadband service provider. So we need to know that those two pieces of the covered partnership, whatever arrangements need to be made by the political subdivision to formalize that arrangement can be undertaken after application submission, but you need to be in a place that you can tell us who is the fixed broadband service provider or providers that are part of the covered partnership, and what is the political subdivision or state. So at the time of application, we need to know what entities are going to be forming the covered partnership, because when we get the application, we need to conduct an eligibility review, and we need to make sure that both entities, both pieces of the covered partnership are eligible.
Okay. Trying to see, we're getting a few more in. Are WISPs, fixed wireless providers, eligible as a service provider as a grant application partner?
Yeah, as a fixed broadband service provider. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They're providing fixed broadband service, so yes.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. And I think a few people have said, hey, why haven't you answered my question? Some of these questions we do have to take back and think about, talk to legal, et cetera. So if we didn't pick your question right now, it could be for multiple reasons. It's in subsequent FAQs, or we actually need to talk internally a little bit more because it's a very specific or nuanced question that we want to make sure we answer correctly and get sign off internally on there. All right, I think that is about it. There was a question here about whether or not the ISP can pay the grant writer and get it covered under the grant under the not to exceed 50K rule.
Yeah, as long as the grant preparation costs are incurred, after the opening of the NOFO, the application window, and prior to the application submission, either part of the payment could come from the fixed broadband service provider or the political or state part of the covered partnership. But there's just that limit of no more than $50,000 being used for grant preparation costs.
Oh, here's a good question. I think this is Dean and also Jennifer probably. What kind of requirements flow down to the subrecipient?
So federal requirements, the same that applies to the prime flows down to the recipient.
The subrecipient.
Yeah, subrecipient.
Yeah. So anything that applies to the recipient would also flow down to the subrecipient.
I think that's about it, unless Jennifer or Doug, there's any other kind of pieces of information we want to share with the folks here on the line.
Other than you mentioned, Susanna, we are working on our next round of FAQs, are going through clearance, legal clearance. As soon as we get that approval, we will post them on our website. I think a lot of the questions that we addressed here will be addressed in that document. We are also continuing to compile more FAQs and for our third round, and develop responses and get legal clearance on them and then post those as well. So this is going to be an iterative process, as I'm assuming as people take a deeper dive into the NOFO, I'm sure they'll other questions will surface, and you can submit them to us, and we will address them in an FAQ and try to get that posted as quickly as possible.
All right.
Nothing for me, Susanna, just thank everybody for joining today. And please, as Jennifer just said, get your questions in because it helps us build a better program as we can educate others with that probably have the same question.
Yeah, because we are receiving a lot of questions, or very similar questions from multiple parties. So, the best way for us to address them is through these FAQs, since this is a competitive grant program. So NTIA has to be careful about giving support to one potential applicant versus another, or give guidance in on a pre-application proposal, because we need to make sure that everyone is treated consistently that is interested in this program. So that is why we are really trying to funnel your questions through an FAQ document.
And we will be having another webinar in a month, and more information
tomorrow too.
Oh, tomorrow too, yeah. But tomorrow's will be generally the same content, but in a month from now, we will have new content. We will leverage whatever questions you guys have to help drive what content we present, and go from there too. Well, thank you, everyone. Oh, sorry, good.
I was going to say that's a good point, Susanna, because a lot of the questions that we're receiving, that indicates to us what should be the content for our next webinar. So whether it's determining eligible service areas or looking at environmental, those might be some of the areas we may try to do, try to cover in the next webinar for this program.
All right, well, thank you so much, everybody, for taking the time to join us and for sending in your questions. And we will get to your questions in subsequent FAQs and other webinars as we can. And everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.